Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining this event today. And I'm going to do a quick introduction to our guest, and I'm not going to steal too much of her thunder, but I thought it would be really great to give a quick introduction to Dr. Ashley Baer. Dr. Baer actually got her Bachelor of Science degree in Neuroscience from Brown, class of 2005. And from Brown, she did her PhD at Yale in ecology and evolutionary biology. And then after that, Ashley Baer completed the Presidential Management Fellowship at both the US Department of State and the National Science Foundation. And she's been a program officer at the National Academies of Science, Engineering and Medicine since 2016, and was promoted to senior program officer in 2018. So we're delighted to welcome her here to summarize this incredibly important report from the National Academies of Science that she was one of the key editors of, and the title of the report, as you have seen in the announcement, is called Promising Practices for Addressing the Underrepresentation of Women in Science, Engineering and Medicine. You know, I think many of us have read this report. I found it to be a combination of depressing, but also just really delighted to see how incredibly well researched this was, and that it was data driven, and also they really got to, I mean, I think you've done brilliantly well, Ashley, and your colleagues, like you really got to making recommendations that could actually make a difference. And so I found it initially, and then, wow, you know, like I really feel that with some concerted effort and really thinking about the data and looking at the history, we can really begin to make some progress in this area. And so wanted to thank you and your colleagues for this fantastic report. I just wanted to mention, you know, one little piece. Again, I'm going to flip over to you, and then Ashley's going to give a brief presentation, and then we're going to open this up for questions from you all. But the one paragraph from the introduction, I just want to kind of underline, because I think this is really critical. The focus is written in the report. The focus of the report is not on fixing the women, but rather on promoting systemic change in the STEM enterprise in an effort to mitigate structural inequities, bias, discrimination, harassment that a substantial body of literature demonstrates significantly undermines the education and careers of women in STEM. So, Ashley Baer, I'm going to pass this over to you now. But again, thank you for this. Thank you for being here. And I'm really looking forward to a discussion with the audience.
Well, thank you, Dr. Lipscomb, for that incredibly kind introduction. And I can't even tell you how much it means to me that you're finding the report to be a useful resource. I mean, that's why we do the work that we do at the National Academies with the Committee on Women in Science, Engineering, and Medicine. So really means a lot. And I'm so glad you highlighted that particular line from the introduction, because that really is what I think guides the work of the Committee on Women right now, this emphasis that it's not about fixing the women, but it is about fixing the system. So I have some slides I'm going to share to provide really a high level overview of this report that we released in 2020. It's a very, I think, rich report, and I would encourage any of you who are interested in really digging into this topic to read the report. It is long, I confess, but I do think I can only really nick the surface with this presentation. So I would encourage you to read it if you are interested in learning more. But the emphasis very much is on moving beyond just the issues to hopefully providing academic institutions and government leaders with some tools and some resources and a plan to try to address these systemic issues that are facing science and are leading to such a loss of talent from these fields. So let's see. So the work we do at the National Academies, all of our reports are guided by what we call a statement of task. And the statement of task is something that we develop with the sponsors of our reports. So all of our reports are supported by external sponsors. And in this instance, this report was supported by the National Institutes of Health, the National Science Foundation, and L'Oreal USA. And so we have this very complicated, very academic, very long statement of task that describes the work that this report is supposed to cover. But I decided instead to share the short version, the simplified version of what this report was supposed to tackle. And it really boils down to 4 major questions. So the first is a review of what is the problem? So what is the issue that we need to address related to the underrepresentation of women in science, engineering, and medicine? Second, and very importantly, what are possible solutions to this problem? Third, if there are possible solutions to this problem, why haven't we seen more progress at a broader range of institutions? And then lastly, what should we do about it? And I just want to also pause for a second and say that the report is available freely for download online at nap.edu. So I encourage you all to go download the full report to learn more. So what is the problem? Well, the problem is that we face a national labor shortage in many science, engineering, and medical professions, particularly in technical fields. We're seeing lost opportunities for innovation and economic gain, and lost talent as a result of discrimination, unconscious bias, and sexual harassment. And these are not new talking points. I mean, we've been talking about these issues. This has been part of the national conversation for decades, but it does bear repeating because we are still talking about this, and this still is an issue. And we know from an abundance of research that bias, discrimination, and harassment are major drivers of the underrepresentation of women in science, engineering, and medicine. And I included these images of these reports here at the bottom of the slide here to emphasize that the National Academies and many other groups have done many studies over many years that have documented the research on the extent of these issues in science and the extent to which bias, discrimination, and harassment are contributing to the underrepresentation of women in these fields. But I really don't want to dwell too much on this piece of this report because, as I mentioned, the real goal with this report was to move beyond this sort of depressing piece to one in which we were trying to equip those who are trying to address this issue with some useful tools and practical advice to try to address the issue. But before I move on too quickly, I do really want to emphasize one really important point that doesn't always get emphasized in these sorts of presentations. And that is that bias, discrimination, and harassment is often experienced more overtly and intensely by women of multiple marginalized identities. So women of color, women with disabilities, LGBTQIA women. And this is something we really need to attend to. And something I'll highlight throughout this presentation is that I think we do have a sense for some promising practices, some things that we can try that we should try and pilot to try to make some progress on this issue. We need to try to approach this with an intersectional approach. We need to try to consider how these endeavors are going to affect all women, because historically we've tended, when we've talked about women, we've unintentionally focused on white middle-class women at research-intensive universities. And so we haven't often benefited all women with these sorts of interventions. So I just really want to emphasize that point because I think it's really important. So we are leaving people behind. I also think one focus of this report that is different from some of the other work of the National Academies and other groups is that it tried to tease apart some of the differences in different scientific, engineering, medical disciplines, because we talk about women being underrepresented in STEM, but actually the picture looks a little different when we look at different disciplines. And so interestingly, for example, if we look at fields like biology and medicine, women are actually very well represented in degree granting programs and at earlier professional and career stages. But we see this real drop off among women in more senior leadership positions in fields like biology and medicine. In contrast, in fields like physics, engineering, and computer science, we see women very underrepresented as early as the undergraduate level. So we see these very different patterns of underrepresentation in different disciplines. And we also see different patterns of sort of biases and stereotypes in these fields. And so, for instance, the research shows that in fields like biology and medicine, there's often this sort of hustle culture that encourages a work-life blurring that can undermine women's careers and advancement into these more senior positions. And this sort of subscribing to what's called the ideal worker norm, which relates to this idea of constant visibility, a constant commitment to one's job, which is really rooted in implicit associations of gender roles, where there's a sort of assumption that if you don't have any responsibilities outside of your career, for example, responsibilities of the home, responsibilities related to caregiving, there's this sort of assumption of a gender division of labor in the home. And we know that that's not really the reality for a lot of people, men and women. So this is something that we see playing out more often in the research when we look at fields like biology and medicine. In contrast, when we look at fields like physics, engineering, and computer science, we see these undermining stereotypes related to concepts of innate brilliance being necessary for success in those fields, which can undermine sense of belonging or interest among women, pursuing those fields. And this occurs despite the fact that we know that women perform as well or better than men in math in high school and college. There still are these lingering stereotypes about women's competence in some of these fields that really can drive them from pursuing those fields. So we see slightly different patterns of representation, I should say very different patterns of representation, and different, seems to be different patterns of biases and barriers playing out in the different disciplines. So now let me try to shift gears here and talk about what can we do about this. So if we look across the landscape of higher education, we do see some success stories. We see institutions that have bucked the trend, that have had successes, that have, are graduating 50% women from their undergraduate engineering program. What's going on there? We see departments where, all of a sudden the picture of the faculty looks really different. So what kinds of strategies and practices are these universities using, and could they potentially be adopted or adapted in other settings, in a way that would help to address this pervasive issue throughout higher education? Well, so the report goes through some of these really practical interventions, and there are some limitations to them, which I will highlight, but I don't want to go there quite yet, because I don't want you to focus on limitations. Let's just talk first about what are some things that you could try that may yield some really positive outcomes. And in the report, we break it down in terms of thinking about recruitment into, a degree granting program or into a job, retention, and advancement. And so when it comes to recruitment, there's some really straightforward things that you could try, or maybe you're doing at Brown, to try to recruit more women into programs. So one is to work continuously to expand the network of candidates. And this can take different forms. It can be a matter of just building up a greater presence at certain professional conferences or in professional societies. It can be working with mentors from underrepresented groups who have access to a broader network. It can be through limiting referral hires that may be, from groups that tend to know people that are more similar to them. It can be through using searchable databases, like the NIH has a searchable database called PRISM, which has a broad swath of the medical community and is a great way to connect with a lot of women and underrepresented minorities. So there are various ways that you could work to expand networks of candidates, but it's not the kind of thing you can just wake up and start to do. It's something that you need to do year round to really build these relationships, really build those bridges. There are also ways to write job descriptions broadly and inclusively, and to avoid gendered language, to try to be, as broad as possible in the description of the job, to attract as broad a pool of candidates as possible. And there are actually all kinds of different resources that can help and companies actually that can help you write these job descriptions more broadly and inclusively. It's also important to be explicit about the institution's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion in advertising job descriptions. And the report goes into a lot more detail on ways that you can write job descriptions broadly and inclusively. Another important thing is to think critically about what we value and reward before interviewing candidates for jobs. I think there's value in stopping and thinking about, are the metrics that we're using to evaluate candidates and that we're using as a proxy for success, in a program or in a job, are they really good metrics? And are they really truly going to be predictive of success? And so establishing ahead of time, what we value and reward and how we're going to evaluate candidates is another way to try to mitigate bias that can creep into this recruitment and interview process. Another strategy is to use structured interviews. So to approach an interview with a candidate with a set of questions that you ask all the candidates, and to use behavioral interview questions. So you don't slip into a reliance on, evaluating someone based on their perceived potential as opposed to the actual experiences they can bring to the table. And then, of course, it's important to educate search committees about bias so that they're aware of the ways that their biases can creep into this process. And then accountability is absolutely essential. So keeping track of, the extent to which bias is creeping into this process, and looking to see whether, for example, if you have a very broad and diverse, first tier pool of candidates, and then in the second round of interviews, all of a sudden you see a lot of that diversity fall away, it may be a good time to ask some hard questions about what's going on there. And so this is just a high level overview of some of the things to think about. The report goes into a lot more detail, but there are some really straightforward questions that we can ask ourselves when we go about recruitment that can help to mitigate some of the bias that we know creeps into this process. It won't remove the bias from the process, but it can help to mitigate that bias. It's also important to think about recruitment in terms of interventions in an educational setting and how to draw more women into STEM educational programs. The report goes into this in great detail. I'm not going to spend too much time on it here, but I just wanted to highlight that three key elements of recruitment into STEM educational programs are the importance of role models, so seeing people that look like you in STEM fields, mentorship, and then certain pedagogical practices like active learning and growth mindset interventions are really important for drawing women into these fields. And I really wanted to emphasize the role models point here. And I included this image. This image is from an online exhibit we have at the National Academies right now. It's called "Progress Was Neither Swift Nor Easy," and it's from a quote from Marie Curie. And it's an exhibit that's highlighting and celebrating women in science, engineering, and medicine. And we launched this exhibit in part because we noticed, and the Committee on Women in Science, Engineering, and Medicine noticed when we walked around the National Academies building that we didn't see that many women on the walls. We saw lots and lots of, actually, there's a lot of imagery on the walls of the National Academies that's really just of science, but there's also a lot of portraiture of great men in science. And we were not seeing a lot of the contributions of women celebrated in science. And this is a problem. If you don't see people that look like you, it sends these implicit signals about who belongs in these fields. And so this is because of the pandemic, this is an online exhibit, but when we, when the pandemic ends and we're able to be back in the building again, it will be installed as a physical exhibit as an effort really in response to this important point that who we see in these fields actually is important. It makes a difference. So I just wanted to emphasize that. And I haven't been back to Brown in a while, but it's something to think about. Is who we see on the walls, who the students see on the walls does matter, and who are in the textbooks and the other pedagogical materials does matter. So then we should take a minute to talk about advancement, especially in the biological sciences, where we know that one of the big issues is that women's careers seem to stall out. We see this underrepresentation of women in these more senior positions. So research points to sponsorship as opposed to mentorship as one promising intervention for getting more women into senior leadership positions. And sponsorship is different from mentorship in the sense that a sponsor is someone who has power and influence within an organization, who actively advocates for someone. And so the sponsorship programs have yielded these really positive results in terms of getting women into senior leadership positions. Then there are other really sort of straightforward practical things like establishing clear metrics for promotion and advancement are really key to ensuring, equity in advancement efforts. And then of course, strategies for mitigating bias in promotion. So having more than one person involved in evaluations is really important. That promotes a certain degree of accountability, and of course, more than one's perspective. It helps to, broaden perspectives on people's performance. Any effort to ensure that the review process is transparent and accountable, if there are reasonable timelines, and then, making sure that we're collecting data just to see if bias is creeping into the process. Are we seeing that certain groups are starting to fall out of the promotion pipeline after they have a baby, after certain life events? Are we seeing certain patterns that we should be keeping an eye on? If we're not collecting the data, then we don't know. And so it's so important to be monitoring these processes within our organizations, because we know from years and years and years of research that we are all subject to these biases, and they do have a profound effect. And then another really important point here is to think of ways to encourage and reward contributions to the hard work of diversity, equity, and inclusion. This also, I think, is the report spoke to the importance of this point as it relates to mid-career women in science, and this sort of service component, because we often find that it's the women, often the women of color in departments, that take on this work of trying to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion, in the department, in the institution. And yet this work is often takes away from the, research and grant writing activities that the institution often is valuing, at a higher way than this work to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's time consuming, it's under-resourced, and yet it's so important. And we always talk about how important it is. And there are institutions that are building in explicit, acknowledgement and reward for this work into, for example, tenure and promotion criteria, and other ways of rewarding and acknowledging that work. So this is a very important factor to consider when we think about advancement, especially into those more senior positions. And then, of course, retention is key. We don't want to just recruit people into our institutions just for them to leave. And retention really boils down to climate. I mean, ensuring fair and equitable access to resources for all employees and students, and ensuring a positive organizational climate is really key. It's something that that came out a lot in our 2018 report on addressing sexual harassment, because we know that a positive organizational climate is pretty much the number one thing you can do to prevent sexual harassment in your organization. And so some of the ways that you can promote retention through a positive organizational climate are through, equal knowledge of institutional resources and transparency about how resources are allocated, including even having a dedicated employee whose job it is to disseminate necessary information. We know that oftentimes information and resources get shared through these sort of informal networks that oftentimes underrepresented groups don't have access to in the same way as majority groups. And then it's so important to institutionalize the effective policies and practices so they can survive transitions in leadership. We hear time and time again about an effective or promising policy or resource or practice that disappeared when there was a transition in senior leadership. And again, creating these respectful, equitable organizational climates is absolutely key. And this can boil down to explicitly establishing shared values and beliefs with the community, and making use of facilitators of positive organizational climate, such as trying to promote gender balance where possible, mentoring and social networks, and then climate assessments where actually survey the faculty and students to get a sense for how people perceive the climate and how that may differ among different groups. And really not shying away from qualitative assessments, especially when the numbers are very small. I mean, if the group of women of color on your campus are very, very small, you're going to have to use some kind of rigorous qualitative methodology to understand why perhaps those women are leaving. And so it's really important to try to not shy away from qualitative methodologies as well. And it's very important to think about policies and resources that can work to address the family-related needs of students and employees, and acknowledge that people have lives outside of work. So now, if you recall in that earlier slide, we had those 4 questions. The third question was, well, okay, so we first talked about what's the problem, what are possible solutions, but then if there are possible solutions, then why haven't we seen more progress? So the possible solutions I just went through are some of the things that have been tried at other institutions that have seen some successes, and yet there's still a lot of work to be done, and there's still a lot of institutions that are struggling. So why are they struggling, and what gets in the way? What undermines, the success of these sorts of interventions? Well, we found through looking at the organizational change literature and through some focus group research that there's a common set of conditions where if they're present, these interventions can be successful. If they're lacking, oftentimes these interventions are not successful. And they basically boil down to 4 things. So first, it's essential to have committed leadership at all levels. Without the support of leadership, it's very hard to get any traction with these sorts of interventions. Secondly, it's really important to have dedicated financial and human resources. When there's an unfunded mandate and you ask, the one woman of color in the department to take on the DEI work, that's not likely to be a successful strategy. Third, accountability and data collection is absolutely critical. There's so much research on the power of accountability for driving organizational change. And without data collection, we're just wandering around blindly. We have to understand, what are the actual problems in our organization in order to address them. And then lastly, as I mentioned earlier, the adoption of an intersectional approach, acknowledging that we need to be trying to work to benefit all women, and that we have to be very thoughtful and intentional about this. And we have to be aware of the fact that historically, a lot of these efforts, including many of the interventions I just went through, have tended to predominantly focus on and benefit white middle-class women at research universities. And so we need to think more broadly. We need to think about how these sorts of interventions could be adapted for other institutional contexts. And so this is absolutely essential moving forward. And so what should we do next? What should we do now? This is the 4th question on our simplified statement of task. Well, the committee ultimately put forward 9 recommendations, each of which have these very specific implementation actions. And they're targeted at different audiences, so various government stakeholders, leaders in higher education. But rather than walk through each of those recommendations, I think it's more helpful to think about them in terms of a kind of framework, because basically the recommendations are meant to drive a change process. And so they fit into essentially drivers of that change process, which can take the form of accountability measures, mechanisms for rewarding, resourcing, or recognizing these efforts, or ways to encourage leadership of these efforts. And, this could be through federal agencies holding grantees accountable. It could be through the actions of leadership within academic institutions. It could be through the efforts of professional societies to, reward or resource or recognize outstanding efforts to diversity, equity, and inclusion. They're all different ways that that different stakeholders can drive this change process through different incentives, positive and negative. But the change process itself is really a matter of first taking a look at what's going on within your department, your institution, whatever the right level is, through local data collection, qualitative, quantitative, whatever's appropriate, to try to understand, are you having issues with recruitment? Are you having issues with retention? Are you having issues with advancement? and then trying to design some kind of pilot, some kind of approach based on whatever you learn about what your issue is. So it doesn't make sense to invest a lot of effort in recruitment if you're doing a good job with recruitment, but your issue really is about related to advancement, of course. And so then the report recommends that you then take action based on and pilot some kind of effort based on what has worked at other institutions with a similar institutional context, and then evaluate that effort to see what kind of impact it has. And this evaluation piece is key. And especially thinking, again, here's where this intersectional approach is so important, seeing how it's affecting all of the people in the department, thinking about it, how it's affecting all of the women, especially those most marginalized groups, those women of multiple marginalized identities. And then when you find something that works, to try to create policy change so that it can sustain transitions in leadership or fluctuations in the budget, all of these sorts of things that can really undermine the lasting change that we'd like to see. And then, of course, this is a process that would be something we need to iterate over time. And so ultimately, this is what the report calls for, is to take some of the practical and useful guidance that's laid out in the report based in all this research and try to fit into this model. It's hard work. It takes time, but I think that's where we see where we're going to gain some ground on this issue. I think I just want to end on a hopeful note in that this promising practices report, that's what we call it for shorthand, came out in February 2020, and it was right before everything shut down with the pandemic. And pretty much a couple months later, we launched a fast track study on the impact of COVID-19 on the careers of women in academic science, engineering, and medicine that we just released about 2 months ago. And this is also freely available for download. And it has findings, and it lays out a series of research questions. They're very topical, very of the moment. But one of the key takeaways I'll just highlight here in this last minute is that while it seems clear that the pandemic has exacerbated many of the issues facing women in science, engineering, and medicine, we also think we may be in a catalytic moment where there's just a lot more attention and energy focused on this issue right now. And perhaps now is the time to really seize the moment, get it right, and we can see a lot of positive change moving forward. So let me stop there, and thank you for the time, and take any questions.
Thank you, Ashley. That was tremendous. And I'm impressed how much you covered in this condensed period of time, understanding that I have read through the whole report, and it's really spectacular. And I think you did a really fantastic job of capturing the essence of what is a really deeply thorough report. So thanks. What I'm gonna do now is that I'm just gonna encourage everybody to start posting questions in the Q&A panel. And just before we dive into those questions, I just wanted to introduce a couple of other people, if that's okay. And then they're gonna be with me to kick off some questions, and then we'll take some of those from the audience and the participants here today. So first off, Sohini Ramachandran. Professor Ramachandran's in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology and Computer Science. And she directs the Center for Computational Molecular Biology, also interim director of the Data Science Initiative, and studies evolutionary theory and human population genetics. So Sohini, thanks for being here. And Professor Janet Bloom, who is, hey Janet, and she's currently the Deputy Dean of the Faculty Professor in Engineering, and her work focused on mathematical aspects of solid mechanics. Janet, thanks also for being here. So I'm gonna take the liberty of kind of like kicking off with a quick question, then I'm going to hand over to Sohini, and then Sohini is going to hand off to Janet. And if you guys can take a look in the Q&As that are coming in, the questions that are coming in, that would be great. So actually, one of the things that struck me, as you were describing this, and I really think it is kind of somewhat empowering It's like you described kind of a grassroots approach. And I think that there are so many layers, and when you're talking about systemic barriers that really are facing women in STEM fields. There's so many, it can become overwhelming. It's like, well, I'm not Janet Bloom, I'm not deputy dean of the faculty, so what can I do? But I think what really I think is important in a lot of what your message was, you can, and you start with the data, and we're scientists, and so be driven by data, and then don't be embarrassed by the data, show it. Right? You just got to keep looking at it. And we tell our students this, and we tell ourselves this. It's like, even if you have another theory about what's going on, or you think that things are okay, the data's showing you it's not. So I wonder if do you have a couple, I mean, it's obviously, these are the things that we have to think about. Like, do you have a couple of examples where that's really, like you could say, like, this really made a difference?
That's such an interesting question, because you're asking me that just after I watched a documentary. Have any of you seen the Picture a Scientist documentary?
Yes.
Yes. I don't know if that inspired your question, but because that comes to mind exactly as the example probably many of you are familiar with. But and we talk about a lot because some members of our committee on women in science, engineering, and medicine were involved with this sort of what we think of as a sort of historic example at MIT, where the women faculty who were quite underrepresented in the department, led by Nancy Hopkins, came to sort of scratch their heads and think, well, we think we have less lab space than the men, but they tell us we don't. But I guess we could just get out tape measures and find out for ourselves. And they did, and it turned out that yes, indeed, they did have less lab space, and so it led to this report that was a really big deal. And, to his credit, the president of MIT at the time, Chuck Vest, really had to, when he saw this report, really had to struggle with this report, and ultimately came out and said, I saw the data, and I feel, convinced that this is a bigger problem than I had previously given it credit. And, it was really, I think, it was a key moment for this issue. So it's
a great example.
It's a great example. And there are all kinds of, there are these, your jaw falls to the floor kinds of examples that are at this, I think, on the one hand, I always say, on the one hand, this is shocking. On the other hand, it's so unsurprising. So I'll just give one other example of, for those who still hold out any kind of skepticism that there may be any implicit bias or sexism, there's this study that's become pretty famous. It's not from that long ago. I'm trying to remember the year. I think this is 2012 or maybe a little earlier than that. I cannot remember the exact. I think it was 2012, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, where this is a pretty straightforward study. They literally took a resume. It was done by Corinne Mossberg-Cusin and Joe Handelsman and a few other authors. They took a resume for a lab technician position, like a research assistant position, and they just changed the name from, John on one and Jennifer on the other. Everything else about the resume and the application was exactly the same, and sent it out into the world for consideration, and asked, people to consider it and rank it on a couple of different measures, like how much would you pay this person? Would you provide them? How much mentorship would you provide this person? A couple of other things. And just like on every single metric, they were going to pay Jennifer less. They were going to mentor Jennifer much less. It was just absolutely striking. And literally the only thing that was different was the name. And just those sorts of examples just like make your jaw hit the floor. So those are two examples where, you bring the data and it helps to, I think, change the conversation.
Great. Thank you. Great examples. So Sohini, you think you're having some sound problems? Should we jump to Janet or?
Well, can you hear me?
I can hear you brilliantly well. Yeah. Shoot.
Thank you so much again for such a great presentation. And as Diane said, I totally echo that the report its focus on recommendations is really, really useful. I guess, speaking of another use of the word recommendation, one question that's come in through the chat that I'd love to hear your thoughts on are ways that the existing use of reference letters for faculty candidates and also for graduate admissions could potentially be rethought. Did that come up when writing the report, and how this practice might hinder underrepresented applicants, especially, if people are judging the quality of the applicant based on the letterhead and the name of the reference letter writer?
That's such a good question. And I don't have a great answer. It's a tough one, because in the report we talk about, avoid reliance on biased metrics. And then we list, for example, preference letters, GRE scores, and it's like everything you list is pretty much all of the things a lot of the things that you do consider in someone's, application materials. So then you're sort of, well, what are you left with? So it is tricky, because there's research to show that many of these different, metrics there are bias baked into so many of these different metrics. So I don't have a great answer on the reference letters. I will say one interesting idea that was drawn from a great book. It's a great resource published by Abigail Stewart and Virginia Valian, called An Inclusive Academy, that I recommend you all check out, is to, and this maybe is more relevant to like sort of more senior sort of positions where someone would already have a body of scholarship to point to, but to, when possible, to evaluate a candidate's work directly. So if there's a way to, instead of, for example, considering the number of publications or the journal in which you publish, to just have a few people on the hiring committee just read the work directly and evaluate it that way. Because we know that there's sort of like, there are certain, proxies that are biased and do lead to a prioritization of certain groups over others. Like institutional prestige, for example, is one thing that we should try not to rely on, because it tends to benefit white men and then white women predominantly. And there's no like good reason to believe that institutional prestige is going to make a candidate more successful than well-prepared students from other institutions. So it's a tricky thing, and I don't have a good answer on the reference letters, but it's something that I think a lot of smart people are thinking a lot about. And there are there's some guidance in the report about ways to be thoughtful about it. And as long as we're on the topic, all the other thing I'll add is that's in the report is also about thinking about gaps in resumes, and not just, this is something that's important, not just for hiring committees, but also for federal agencies that may be evaluating like grant applications for fellowships and things, to not just dismiss, to not see a gap in a resume and say, oh, this person doesn't have, as much of a strong a track record. So we're not going to consider them as competitive, because, for a lot of good reasons, certain groups are going to be more likely to have those gaps in their resumes than others. For example, if you have to take leave because of you're having a baby or whatever, that's going to affect some people more than others. We know this absolutely from the research. So, yeah.
Yeah, there was I'm going to hand over to Janet, but I was just going to mention that someone put in the chat, I think this is interesting and related to reference letters. I noticed how often men are compared to other men and women to women in reference letters, which contributes to bias. So that there's this like grouping of different categories of people and not scientists as a whole. Anyway, I thought it's a really important thing. So Janet, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ashley. This is wonderful. Thanks for the report, all the work, and this fantastic session. There's one excellent, well, there are many excellent questions here, but one particularly touching one question says, what actions can male research assistants and grad students take towards this effort, especially in labs that are mostly male? I think that's a great question, and appreciate your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I will say the report talks a little bit about male allies. It talks a little bit about bystander intervention. In terms of the research on that is very emerging. We don't know a lot about it. So maybe I can just like take off my National Academies hat and speak from my personal experience, so that I can give some answer. And I'll just say, one thing we know is that sometimes in a group setting, women will speak up, in a lab meeting setting or something, and they'll be interrupted, or their contribution won't seem to like make it to the table. So if there's a way that you can, be looking out for those sorts of patterns in the conversation and be an ally and not letting that happen, then I'm sure that would go a long way to, making people feel included in the conversation, making people feel heard. I know that's something I benefited from in my career. So that's this is just like my Ashley Bear contribution to you. It's not in the reports on the research per se, but it's, I think I speak for a lot of us when I say thanks for raising the question, and thanks for, wanting to be an ally.
There is a related point as well, which I love the questions that are coming in, because they're beautifully overlapping. But just to your point, Ashley, and to the question that was posed, this is from a participant. Our faculty conversations in diversity, equity, inclusion are often now around underrepresented minority issues, as they absolutely should be, and discussions of racial diversity, equity, inclusion. But there is a lack of discussion around sexism and misogyny. How do we identify male advocates who acknowledge these inequities, speak up, and keep others accountable on these issues, so that it's not just the work of female identifying persons? Again, like I think that I love the audience that's really participating in this, and it really, we are a community, and it can often just take one person to just stand up and say, you know what, like, this is not right. to have a cascade of opinion. But yeah, so I interrupted someone. Is Janet or Sohini is about to jump in?
I actually wants to comment on that. I think that'd be great, and then I do have a question.
I was just going to say that ideally we don't leave it to individuals to have to fight the fight. Ideally, I think one of the points the report makes, and that it just is a big part of the conversations I've been in a lot lately, it's ideally we get to a point where like our organizations and our institutions are transformed, and we have policies and practices in place so that it's not the burden of individuals to have to fight these fights. So I think that's like the hopeful future that we'd like to see, is one in which, we use the sort of a universal design approach to benefit everyone, and address, systemic racism, systemic sexism within the context of our organizational structures, and not put the onus on individuals. So anyway, that's me waxing poetic, but
no, great. Agree. No, important point, totally. Go ahead, Sohini.
Oh, I was wondering if I could take the liberty to ask a question of my own, which stems from my own experience as a life scientist, but in terms of the spectrum you were talking about sort of when underrepresentation kind of appears in the life sciences. But I was curious about in the report, I really liked how you touched on the recommendation of structured interview questions as a great example of creating uniformity as you evaluate applicants. I was wondering what kinds of structures could be put into place for the negotiation process? Because I think sometimes throughout retention and advancement, there are different points of negotiation, and there's a lot of literature about the different ways that different genders might view this, or different minoritized individuals might view those opportunities. And I've sometimes wondered about, how the negotiation process could be made more uniform, so that people don't later feel like, oh, I got differential resources because I didn't know to ask about certain things.
Yeah, I confess I don't think I have a great answer to that question, but it's such a good question, because I think you're right. I always get kind of nervous when I hear about this, like, oh no, like women, you need to just go in there and like negotiate harder, because as far as I know, I think there is some research to show that that's not always going to work out. that's not always a strategy actually that does work out. So I don't have a good answer to your question, but I think and I'm not sure to what extent, we may mention it in passing in the report, but I don't think we go into it very deeply. But yeah, that's something to flag for us to think about more deeply, because it's a really important issue. I mean, I know that that many organizations are, I think, trying to do more of these. Their HR departments are trying to do more of these sort of like equity reviews, where they like look across salaries within particular job families to see like, okay, are there huge discrepancies in what people are being paid, and can we address this? But exactly what that looks like and how it works, I don't know. So sorry, I don't have a better answer to that question, but thanks for raising it. It's a really important issue.
Maybe I can comment on that as well. I think it's actually incumbent upon the people doing the negotiating on the administrative side to be very aware of that, and keep in mind differences in negotiating styles, and even suggest to the person that you're hiring, this is your moment to ask for what you want, so ask for it. And being that encouraging to people, particularly when you may sense a reticence to do that. So I think that's at least a starting place. And people about to go into the negotiating process for themselves, if they could get some mentoring coaching from their department chairs or senior colleagues, that's also another angle. So I think both fronts can help. Maybe not make everything perfect, but can help. Maybe I can turn to another question from the Q&A, which is, of course, of interest to me, all of us. A faculty member asked, could you please discuss the gender imbalance that exists in physics and engineering? The gender imbalance we see in the United States at the undergraduate level is not observed in all other countries. And what do you think is going on here?
That's a great question. This study only looked at the US. So I'm not sure what's going on here relative to other countries. All I can say is that it does seem, based on our research, that there are a lot of factors at play that undermine girls and women girls from a young age, and women, their interest and sort of sense of belonging in the fields of engineering and physics. And from a pretty young age, we start to develop these associations between white men in particular, but white and Asian men and those fields. And I think there are a lot of factors driving that, including media representations, and, the ways that the ways that students are introduced to those fields in classrooms also, I think, plays a role. And that's why I think I didn't go into this a lot in the presentation, but why these sorts of pedagogical practices like these growth mindset interventions, which basically put simply is impresses upon students that their knowledge can be improved by learning. How about that? Yields greater results in terms of interest and performance in these fields. But I can't speak to why the representation is different in other fields, but it's fascinating. And yeah, this report didn't really delve into that. Would be an interesting topic for a future study for sure.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Sohini. We may, we're about 4 minutes away from the end of our session, which I cannot believe. But just go ahead, Sohini, and then I think what would be really great is if someone back there behind the Zoom video can capture these questions. That would be really great. And I think we'll share them with Ashley, and I think maybe we'll post on our website or something like that. But they're really, really thought-provoking. So Sohini, go ahead.
I wanted to ask one more question from the chat, although I might paraphrase it a little bit, so I'll apologize in advance if I alter the intention of the question asker. But can the National Academies or other extramural groups like NIH, AAAS, NSF put forward recommendations that about both men and women taking caregiver leave and that they're both entitled to it? Maybe I'll add my own question about this is if there were thoughts that came up about gender neutral parental leave as we're ready to report. But you know, the person asking the question is saying, which I agree with, that it's important for women to not appear to be absent more often than men in this context of
Yes, this report touched upon this issue a little bit, and does, for example, highlight that that there should be institutional policies and resources that acknowledge that that employees and faculty members like have family and life related needs, and they need genuine, you know, time out from work, for example, if they need family leave, and that that should not be, you know, time to write a book or publish articles. It should be time set aside for those caregiving responsibilities. And that it's a complicated issue and a complicated landscape, especially in a university setting in terms of like parental leave, because oftentimes faculty salaries are a combination of institutional support and then the the support from federal funding agencies. But I'm so glad that you raised this question, Sini, because this is absolutely a topic that the Committee on Women in Science, Engineering, and Medicine wants to pursue. I think the hope is that this would be like our next major study would be on this topic of caregiving responsibilities, the impact of caregiving responsibilities, both in terms of parental care, but also for children, but also in terms of caregiving for like elder care for family members, the impact on women's careers, but also thinking more broadly, because there's some pretty striking research on attrition from STEM fields for both men and women. For example, after the birth of their first child, it's like something like 40% of women leave full-time STEM careers after the birth of their first child, and like 25% of men or something from like a relatively recent study. But there are also, once again, there's sort of, we think there are promising practices, again, that could be put in place to try to address this issue. And the pandemic could not be, again, a better sort of catalytic moment to get our arms around this issue. So many of us are, you know, managing caregiving and work. And so, yeah, this is a huge, huge topic. I think it's on everyone's minds. And I do think the federal agencies are thinking a lot about it, and we're thinking a lot about it. And I'm sure the universities are. So thanks for raising it. And I wish I had better concrete guidance now, but it's certainly an issue we want to tackle.
Great. Well, I'm going to close us out. And I'll do so by certainly thanking Janet and Sohini, but most importantly, thanking you, Ashley. I feel that this is a beginning. These are all beginning conversations, and there's kind of a long road ahead. This was tremendous. You know, again, I think having making proposals and coming up with ideas, focusing on the data, focusing on transparency, looking at things you don't want to look at, not going by impressions. You know, I think we've often heard things and heard people say, well, you know, women are okay. You know, the women are doing okay. Look at the data. And then also, I think I mentioned to you, I'm on a European group called ALBA Network, and we've been looking at some of the funding data, which was a question in the chat here. And it's the same, like the growing decrease in the portion of women who are actually in research and then being funded in research is following the same trajectory in the US and in Europe. So like there's, as you point out so incredibly well, there's a systemic issue and they're going to take a system solution. And I do think that you made a really important point. It's like, you know, don't lean on the individuals, but really think about like the leadership from above. And I think we've been incredibly lucky at Brown, and put Janet is in the leadership here, but has been a tremendous advocate. And I think that we are on a good path. But I really think everything that you have talked about, we're going to underscore, and I hope take this moment when the participants here to really say, yeah, that was the start of a really important conversation, and we're going to keep it going. So thank you. Thanks for the participants. Thanks again for being here. It was tremendous. And just, I'm going to email you in a second, and maybe we can keep chatting just for 15 minutes afterwards too. All right, it's great. Thanks so much.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much. And please stay in touch.
We will. Thank you.